Hello, everybody. My name is Odell Horn. I'm the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men's president. And on this particular Minority Report, we're going to be talking to Blake Trent. He is the pastor of Dallas First United Methodist Church in Dallas, Georgia. Blake, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Blake. We're going to be talking about you, and we're going to be talking about race, and we're going to be talking about how we as brothers in Christ have different perspectives and how different experiences inform our perspectives. So first, I want to start off by asking you to introduce yourself to everybody. Tell us where you're from, where you went to school, and how you got to Dallas first.
Okay. I'll give the Reader's Digest version because that's a lot. And, I'm
Okay.
sure people have a short attention span. We don't want to have an hour-long story of Blake Trent. But the short of it is I was born in Dahlonega, Georgia. I grew up in, I guess, what folks would call generational poverty. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from high school. And so I graduated from high school in Lumpkin County, went to the University of Georgia, first person in my immediate family to go to college, got a degree in print journalism with a minor in American history. And toward the end of my, and during that time, I had been United Methodist. I became a United Methodist in the latter years of my high school experience. And from there, I had been volunteering with youth groups as a youth intern, while I was in college. And anyway, toward the end of my college education, I had been doing a lot of writing and storytelling, and I sort of became disenchanted with it a little bit. I really love journalism, but like local journalism is an incredibly important pillar of our society. But there's also the side of it that says if you've talked about one city council report, you've talked about them all when you're living in a small town. There's only so many words you can get into a report about the ditch they're digging on, so and so highway. What I discovered is that in the midst of all that, I think the way that I would say it is that I really enjoyed telling stories and reading stories, but I just hadn't found the one that I needed to tell. And, praise God, the story that I needed to tell over and over again is the story of Christ and God and his great love for us. And so that sort of hobby of being in ministry with students became, the main focus. I became a youth minister. And then I went to seminary, and I went to Gammon Theological Seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. So I definitely took a different path for seminary. I went to a historic African-American seminary, and yeah, it's been a great ride. Learned so much there, and after that, I transitioned to being a youth minister in LaGrange, Georgia, at LaGrange First, and then by some really cool workings of grace, I became their associate pastor whenever I finished seminary and was commissioned. And then after being ordained, I was appointed here to Dallas First, and I am moving into my second year. So it was definitely a weird first year considering, I got to know half the names and then we went into a global pandemic. So there you go.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's a very interesting year for to be a pastor at a new church. Yeah. um, so you were at Georgia. You
Yes, sir.
studied communications. That is at Peabody. Is that correct?
Uh, no, I went to oh Lord, Grady, the Grady School of Journalism.
Grady School
So,
of Journalism.
so
Okay.
I was written. I think Peabody may be filmed and digital. So
Body's filmed. Okay.
yeah.
All right. And so you became disenchanted with that, but you felt that there was a calling there.
Yeah. So I enjoyed, I wouldn't say I necessarily came disenchanted with it as much as it just wasn't adding the meaning that I thought it would, you know. It's a long journey to get to the New York Times or to get to the Washington Post, or, if you're into sports, it's a long journey to get to ESPN or what. You
Mm-hmm.
usually do 25, 30 years in a local community, and there's not a ton of large local papers even,
Mm-hmm.
for you to get
Mm-hmm.
connected with. So yeah.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
So you became involved in youth ministry, and you were going through. When did you decide that you wanted to go through the ordination process?
So my senior year of college, I sort of said like, okay, I think I'm going into ministry. And in the midst of that, I said, I want to be a youth minister, but then more and more I kept saying, what happens if I do youth ministry? And after a while, I realized I'm talking about things that extend far beyond the scope of a 16, 17, 18-year-old. And then it just became clear, well, why don't I just go ahead and get an education while I'm doing this? And if I need to, at some point, transition to working with older kids, whether that's 20 or 60, I'll have those skills and can move forward in those next steps. And so that's just how it came about. So I went to seminary sort of part-time my first year. I went half-time my first year. And then the final 3 years, I just went full-time.
So why did you choose Gammon Theological Seminary?
So it's a good question. So I grew up, I've had 6 open heart surgeries as a child and a teenager. And I guess, the joke I always make is every one of those took place at Emory. So I guess I was afraid if I went to school at Candler, they'd just have another heart surgery lined up waiting for me. But no, I sort of knew Emory's campus and I wanted to do something different. I wanted to see something different. I had a youth minister whenever I was in high school, Jody Ray, who went to Candler, but also whenever I was at the University of Georgia, there were just a lot of educational opportunities that opened up to me my final year. So I got my minor in history, and some of the classes that I was taking was, the history of Black America, the history of Mexico. And so I was doing all of these readings from a more minority perspective, since we're on Minority Report, and that really sort of opened my eyes to seeing the world from a different perspective. And when I went and sort of met folks at Gammon and looked around and talked to some folks, it felt right. So felt right to do something different. And it definitely was. I joke that for the 3.5 of my 4 years, I was pretty much the only Caucasian person in all of my classes. And then in the final year, there were a couple of folks who came in and started cramping my style, just kidding. But but I got an education in theology and a different perspective sociologically, from ecclesial perspectives. It was really educational. And I made some lasting friendships too.
Talk to me about that, because I've been to a historically Black college and we've always had at least one white male student. Okay. You are that white male student at Gammon. Tell me about that experience.
So, at first it was just trying to get a read on things and listen. And, what's fun is, now I've done some, since arriving here in Dallas, we've done some, implicit bias trainings with our staff and with some other folks. And I've started building relationships with different ministers in our community, especially with African-American churches, to try to make a bridge and a connection between, different churches of different cultural backgrounds. But in those early days, it was, I always joke that a lot of the things that I try to help folks who are white understand now were things I learned by being, kind of stupid in person 5 to 7 years ago, and it some of the things were understanding, the difference between hardship and racism. So for me, the way that I help folks who don't necessarily feel comfortable hearing words like white privilege is to help them understand, you can have a really, really hard life as a white person. That's not what white privilege means. It means that the thing that doesn't make your life hard is the color of your skin. You do not get great obstacles and challenges and discriminations thrown at you because you're white. So you can have a hard life and still have white privilege. And that was something that it took me sort of asking and some dumb questions and stumbling through and possibly looking like a fool while I was in seminary. But those were really important things for me to learn, because, in our country, had I experienced all of my challenges and been a Black male, it would have been exponentially more difficult, exponentially more challenging for me to overcome some of those things. So I learned that. I learned a lot more about liberation theology. That's not something that, I learned a lot growing up, and I did not grow up in church. Really, I didn't become a Christian until I was 17. But even in those 3 or 4 years that I was in church as a volunteer and as a student, I didn't hear a lot of Moses stories. I didn't hear a lot of the prophets. I didn't hear a lot about Jesus sort of blowing the trumpet in open court about the injustices and the wrongs that were taking place in Jerusalem and in the world around him. So that definitely gave me a much deeper understanding of the call of the gospel and my call as a minister, to make sure those things are being laid out and spoken and addressed from the pulpit and in other ways. So.
Let me ask you a couple things. You mentioned the difference between hardship and race. Explore that with me a little bit more, because I'm sure that there are folk, particularly white folks, who feel like an African American got a position at a job or got accepted to a college because of their race, and so therefore they are adversely affected as white men and women. And how do you navigate that conversation?
I have those conversations on occasion, and I think the first is trying to control my frustration, and I've gotten better at that over the years. But I always begin by, as I said, trying to define white privilege in the most basic of terms so people can understand it, that no one is saying that your life has not been hard. Everyone has difficulties and obstacles they have to overcome in this life. That's part of it. And scripture never promises like, hey, if you follow Jesus, your life will be easy. In fact, I would argue that many of us who feel called to do ministry would say, my life was pretty easy until Jesus got involved, and then he called me to all sorts of really difficult, challenging things. But so, I begin there, but trying to talk about the history of our country, to sort of highlight that, but for those programs, but for those opportunities, there are lots of places, especially regions like the Southeast, where there would be no opportunity for upward mobility. And I think more and more in the last 4 or 5 years, we've gotten into conversations about, generational wealth. Like why is there such a large divide in wealth between people of color and Caucasian folks? And well, if your great grandparents were slaves and didn't own any property, and we're only 2 to 3 generations removed, it's a lot harder to build that. And so I think there's been I try to have those conversations and point to the history of it. And I think for so many of us, the memory can be kind of short. But since it is Dr. King, it's Martin Luther King Day, we have to remember that the 60s weren't that long ago. In fact, most of the folks in our church, the larger majority of churches, are probably populated by people who were alive when Dr. King was marching and when Dr. King was assassinated. So we're not that far along yet. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the things I try to highlight whenever I'm able to do that with one-on-one, or small group discussions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So you mentioned that you learned a lot about liberation theology and talked about Moses and the prophets. Tell me more about some of the things that you learned.
So, the joy of doing seminary in general is that you get to take, Old Testament, New Testament, Hebrew, all of that. But, it's in the midst of all of that learning of trying to see that through a lens of some kind. And we all sort of have our personal theological lens. And for me, having mentioned, generational wealth and generational poverty and sort of, my experiences as growing up as a sort of poor Appalachian white kid, I understood sort of the call for justice and the care for those who are dealing with difficulty. And, throughout the biblical narrative, we find, God's consistent call for justice and freedom and for liberating the oppressed, like even Jesus's first sermon, which is, one of those sermons that everybody walks away grumbling from, is, I've come to release the captives, to give sight to the blind, to really highlight that God's reign has come. And reading those things and then hearing them from the historical perspective of an African American community really helped me to see the perspective of liberation and justice that not just is necessary, but for people of color required. Because the biblical narrative for so long was, especially in the Southeast, was focused and viewed through the lens of white folks. It's horrible that we have to highlight it because it should be a common part of history. But slavery had biblical roots in a lot of regards. There were people who pointed to scriptures that talked about it. Even I, as a child, heard folks somehow justifying not slavery, but the separation of races, on some sort of biblical basis, which when you read from a historic Black college or seminary perspective, that's not what you get. You don't get that at all. You get the Jesus who is constantly reaching out to the other, who's building the bridge, who's welcoming all folks into the fold, not just those who some want and some don't.
So let me ask you then, how then, when you take liberation theology that you learn at Gammon, and now you become a minister, an associate minister, youth minister, associate minister, and then you become a pastor at churches that are white, the reception to these liberation theological principles that are biblical, good conversations, bad conversations, people have left the church, people have joined the church. What's that landmine?
So on occasion, you have folks who say, like, I don't like what you believe, I'm leaving. I never want that to be the case, but there have been a few occasions where people just say, like, you're not going to change my mind. I think what you are saying is wrong, and you're making, I don't know, the church political, which I've always appreciated what our bishop has said, is that you don't get crucified by the state if you're not doing something political, but I for those, I try to, at least have us depart and split in peace. Like I said, it's happened very rarely. But in those contexts, some of the things about, liberation can be applied to a variety of contexts. Like I believe that, part of spiritual growth and development and discipline is that we all sort of start out in our little bubble. And in order for us to grow in any regard, we have to burst through the bubble to get to a larger bubble. And then when that one gets too small, we have to burst through it to get to an even bigger one. And I think part of that is our theological understanding. And, we live in a world where biblical literacy is probably not at its all-time highest. And so calling folks to the scriptures and then to say, so, where do we see a connection point with our own life and our own history when we read the story of the Hebrew people being rescued from Egypt? Or where do we make the connecting point for Jesus saying, I've come so that to preach release of the captives and the restoration of sight to the blind, So in sharing those kinds of things, hopefully in most regards, people start to make connections. And because it's, Martin Luther King Day, some of the things that I think have been most helpful in that regard is asking people to actually read or listen to some of Dr. King's speeches. They are riddled with scripture. He was a minister, and it's mind-boggling to me the amount of Christians who don't know any of the speeches, the texts, the words of Dr. King. So, and what I've found multiple times, even since coming here to Dallas, is one of the things that I had a couple of folks do who helped me when we partnered with a bunch of churches for an MLK celebration last year, was to have a couple of white folks in our community who were part of that service just read the letter from the Birmingham jail, and when you have to read that part about the white moderate, how the white moderate really is the most challenging part of us getting to this place where we can actually have equality. Because at least the people who are vehement racists, you can identify them pretty clearly. But the folks who remain silent because they don't want to rock the boat in any regard, those are the harder ones to figure out. And they're the ones with the most probably social capital to offer. So.
Let's talk about social relationships. So you mentioned a couple times about different things that, for example, last Martin Luther King day holiday, some of the churches in Dallas got together or and surrounding community. But let's talk about you at Gammon. How did you navigate the social dynamics with you being in, for many of your classes, the only white student in the class?
Um, One, everyone there was so gracious to me. Because I assume, I hope, for the most part, I think people said, bless his heart, he has no idea, whenever I would say something stupid, because I knew that I would. I think it took a level of just being willing to be honest and share. And then it also took being able to have, I won't say correction, but a different perspective offered to me, and then being able to accept that. And for the most part, when that perspective was offered, it was offered in grace. You know, and it's easy, I think, to fall into the trap of saying you don't understand this because you are a white man, and it's true. I don't understand it, and I never will understand it. But I think in hearing that, also everybody who I had meaningful conversations with took time to help explain why that's so hard for me to understand. And that's what helped me get to the place where I could understand my own privilege and then hopefully communicate it to others and be an ally as best as possible. So I had some friends at Gammon who I'm good friends with. I have folks, we have, friends in ministry still who are part of the United Methodist Church. I have folks who I chat with on Facebook or text with or whatever. That sort of helped build relationships with other folks too, beyond seminary.
So you what I'm gathering, some principles that I'm gathering out of that is that you were vulnerable, you were honest, number one, in conversations, you were vulnerable. However, the reception was that people treated you gracefully.
Yes. And I think that is the biggest key, because, I can remember being, I will say ignorant, but also innocent enough to say, hey, there's a lot of methamphetamines in the mountains. I'm sure that that's similar to issues like, crack or, whatever in the inner cities, and people graciously sort of helping me understand the differences and the nuances of that, when I could have easily just said that there is no issue of race here. This is an issue of poverty or drugs or whatever. People could have just said, like, are you dull? Like, have you paid attention to our history or to the news? But they didn't. They said, well, yeah, let's talk about that, because those are, those definitely are problems for both communities, but let's talk about the differences in those communities.
That's good.
Yeah, it was true education.
So now moving forward, you're doing this work, reaching out to different churches in Dallas, in the Dallas community. So how, without, I don't want to get you fired.
Okay. I like where this question's going.
How did it go last year, Martin Luther King holiday weekend? And what's the future hold in light of, and it's difficult to judge, but in light of the recent developments that what happened at the U.S. Capitol, and even last summer with the protests with Black Lives Matters, what's the tone like? What's the tenor like? Not just within your congregation, but within the Dallas community.
Last year's Martin Luther King celebration, I think went well. People were gracious enough. One of the ministers. So this year we're working virtually for our Martin Luther King Day offering. But last year, Reverend Johnny McBurrows, who's at Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church downtown, offered to let us host, and that was the first time that Dallas first got to host the MLK celebration, which is only for the city, for the community of Dallas and Paulding County. I only think it's 5 or 6 years old. I mean, it's a fairly new celebration community-wide that's ecumenical, but that was a huge honor, and so we got to do that. But I do think that the challenges of this past year have raised tensions, and I was talking with an author yesterday, Sarah Thabarge, myself and some of my colleagues who are in an ACE group together. And, one of the things that she talked about that I think is really helpful in those kinds of discussions is right now, our reflexes are all very strong. She's a medical professional. So she talks about, when you get a reflex test, they sort of knock you on the knee and your brain doesn't go, I should move my leg and my foot. It just does. And, because of the political tensions, because we're all living, on screens and through social media, because we're not looking each other in the white of the eyes and sitting across the table as much as we once did, I do think we all are struggling to get past the initial reflex that people have. So there have been some reflexes, and I've had to have conversations, with folks whenever I say things like, yeah, Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying that I have co-signed and become a card-carrying member of a political organization and espouse every one of their beliefs and every one of their creeds. I am saying, though, that in our country, Black lives should have the same amount of value as any other lives. And historically and statistically, that is not the case. So, and that has caused some ruckus and ruffled some feathers on occasion, but it's also the clearly trying to understand from a, ministry perspective that I am not in support of any kind of racist theology, any kind of, discriminatory action from any group, any people. And making sure that we don't make too broad of a connection or paint with too broad a brush when we say things like that. And I do think that's one of the great sadnesses of the last year is, everything has become political, and not everything is meant to, And I have wonderful church leadership who, had come from all sorts of political beliefs, but we've had to have like deep conversations about like, okay, like this is not a political statement. This is just a mask because I love you and I don't want you to get sick and die if I can help it. So I think overcoming that has made it somewhat difficult. But this year, last year when we hosted, my job was basically just to be a glorified DJ to welcome folks to the church. I read a short piece from the letter from the Birmingham jail, and that was it. I was new to the community. I was just happy to be part of it. This year, myself and a handful of ministry leaders from Dallas who have been talking since George Floyd's death. We've got a couple of police officers, some ministers from white churches, black churches, a variety of denominations. We've been meeting online every couple of weeks to talk about sort of issues of race and faith and building bridges with each other. And so this year, that group, we sort of decided, because there's not really a safe way to do a Martin Luther King Day, worship service in person in a building. So I think 6 or 7 of us are going to be doing we're going to read the post-Selma March speech in different sections, film it, and then we're going to put it together, and different members of the community. I think we've got a retired police officer who's now a pastor, a current police officer who's at the sheriff's department, and then 4 or 5 ministers who were part of that reading, and we'll share that with the Paulding County community. So.
Amen. It is good to hear that this event is going on still, even in a quarantine and a Zoom environment in Dallas, Georgia, and Paulding County. So let me ask you before we close, give us some advice. If you are a white student at a black seminary, what should you expect? How should you enter into conversations? What should you be prepared for? What was the thing that surprised you the most? What was the thing that disappointed you the most?
I think the thing that I would tell folks that they should walk into, and this is if you're a white student at a black school, if you're a white student at a white school, anytime you're walking into a place where your main focus is to get educated, it's to go in with a willingness to be changed, because education does that for all of us. I think one of the most disappointing things that I've seen throughout my life is folks who go to school for to get a piece of paper and a degree, but miss the educational transformation that really is supposed to take place in there. You know, you can go get that piece of paper and really have not learned anything and really have not grown. But, you know, the purpose of education for me is to see growth, to see transformation inwardly and outwardly. And so if you're going to an all African-American school as a white person, expect that. Maybe expect it a bit more than you would if you're going as a white person to an all white school or whatever, predominantly white school. But I guess the thing that surprised me the most was, you know, when we were talking about New Year's resolutions yesterday, and how, you know, psychologically, when you do your New Year's resolution and you tell everybody about it during the process, usually they say that's one of the quickest ways for you to not fulfill your New Year's resolution in any regard, because what you're doing is giving yourself like a little pat on the back every time that you say, like, yeah, I'm on this new diet. And then, you know, 2022 rolls around, you go, yeah, I lost 3 pounds the entire year. Because psychologically we're telling ourselves, I've lost this weight, even though we haven't. We're just trying to commit to losing weight. And I think for me, it was the thing that was probably most disappointing but revelatory was I probably in the early days wanted to pat myself on the back more than I should have, about saying, like, look, I'm trying to get it, or I'm at a all African-American school, so I get it. And being there and surely realizing over and over again, I don't get it. I don't get it. Or look, that there, but for the grace of God go I, or yeah, that's me that they're talking about. You know, Dr. King is talking about me oftentimes when he's talking about the white moderate. So I think that was definitely a disappointment for me, but it was also a moment of growth. And I think, you know, the thing that was most surprising and just amazing was how so much of that wealth of knowledge and perspective and insight on the faith and on the church and on scripture, if you are a white Christian, you may not have heard at all. How you may not know any of it whatsoever. And, you know, one of the things that it's caused me to do more and more is to you know, look at our AME brothers and sisters and look at, you know, Kojic, you know, churches, and, you know, Interdenominational Theological Center. It definitely lives up to its name because there are so many different denominations involved. But, you know, like we went to England this past February to see sort of John Wesley's roots, you know, and we don't talk enough about the fact that the Wesleys were like some of the very first and loudest, you know, proponents of ending slavery, and we ought to. We really need to. So, yeah, I think for me it was that deep wealth of knowledge that I got about the Black Christian experience that I don't know that I would have learned otherwise. So.
Well, Blake, thank you for joining us on Minority Report. We are going to be interviewing Jody Ray, who's you said your former youth pastor.
Cool.
He's also a graduate of Gammon Theological Seminary. But I'm going to give you any concluding and closing thoughts.
I'm just grateful to get to be with you, and grateful for the work of United Methodist Men, and hopefully we get to partner in person at some point in the next few months. So. Thanks for letting me be on.
No problem, Blake. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
God bless you.